Okay, let me try my talk. Oh gosh, being an old woman is terrible. All right, here we go, guys. Okay, I'm an old Moravian. Can you tell that? What you're looking at is Salem, North Carolina. And what I want to talk to you about today is the relationship between the Cherokees and the Moravians that ended up getting some Cherokee girls to come to Salem to school pre-removal. So that's my story. But what you're looking at now is a photograph of what the little town of Salem probably looked like during that day. It all began at the beginning of the 19th century, after the French and Indian War was over and the American Revolution. And the Moravians, guys, I saw a lot of you coming in that I didn't know. So many of you don't know who the Moravians are, but they're a German sect from Czechoslovakia that came to the United States, first to Bethlehem and then to Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And because they wanted to be missionaries, that's always been their goal. But they spoke German, which was a little bit of a problem. But in the 19th century, the beginning of the 19th century, after the French and Indian War and the American Revolution were over, there was peace. And the Moravians thought that maybe they could start a mission among the Cherokees because they were right there close to them. So the Moravians sent a man named Abraham Steiner, who was real well suited for the task, to attend the Cherokee Council in 1801, which was in present-day Northwest Georgia. Anyway, the Cherokees were not interested at all in Abraham Steiner having these Germans preach the word to the Cherokees, but they were really interested in educating their children. And at that council meeting was a man named James Vann, whom everybody knows who James Vann is. Now, if I share my, oh wait, nope. James Vann had children, imagine. So he really wanted the Moravians to start a mission. Now, what you're looking at is James Vann's house, which was in Spring Place and present day Spring Place. So even though the council wasn't particularly fond of the Moravians preaching the gospel, he really wanted his kids to go to school, as did another chief and big leader who was Charles Hicks. So they talk the council into, or whatever happened, not having been at that council meeting, I don't quite know. I'm sure they would have done better had I been there. But they do allow the Moravians to start a mission. And that's what you're looking at is the sign that is in Spring Place, Georgia. Many of you have been to the Vann House and you know where the Moravian Cemetery is there and where the Moravian mission would have been, which is in sight of the Vann House. I know you're not going to believe this, but the Cherokee and the Moravian were similar in a couple of ways. One was that the Cherokee Nation owned the land. You know, individuals didn't own land. And the Cherokee people who lived on that land owned the improvements on the land. They owned the peach trees and the corn cribs and the cabins, much like the Moravians in Salem, because in Salem, the Moravians owned all the land. And if you had a shop, if you were a tin maker or a blacksmith or you made shoes, the church allowed you to use that land and allowed you to build your place of business there. So Moravians were not really accustomed to individual land, just like the Cherokees. They were accustomed to living as a unit and functioning as a unit. The other way that the Moravians and the Cherokees were a bit similar is that the Cherokees were matrilineal society, meaning that descent was traced through the mother and the children were members of the mother's family. And most importantly, women had the right to the land and improvements. They farmed and maintained the household. Cherokee women made decisions about the education of their children, while Cherokee men hunted, they went to war, they engaged in diplomacy. So Cherokee and Moravian women had a bit in common. The Moravians lived and worked also in a gender divided society. There were single sisters and single brothers, and they lived in separate houses. There were widows who lived together and married people who lived together. But the single sisters actually had earned their own living. The single sisters had the girls' boarding school. There you go. That was the girls' boarding school. That was the single sisters' house. And the single sisters successfully ran this school. At the time, they also had a glove making business. They did laundry for the single brothers. And the boarding school that they had in Salem was geared to people who could afford it, because the Moravians didn't have much money, and the women supported themselves through this girls' boarding school. Interestingly, it filled quickly with really wealthy Southerners. And the reason of that was during the Revolutionary War, they had camped around Salem, and they knew about the Moravians, and they knew about their gender divided society, and they knew that they educated women. So all these wealthy planters and government officials sent their daughters to Salem to the Moravians. And they also knew that the Moravians believed in educating women. The boarding school stayed so full that they actually had to send out notices to the public just to say, please don't bring your girls here because we have no more room. Each year, the boarding school had an examination, or a graduation, as we would call it. It was a big event in Salem, and it was held in Home Church. That's a photograph of Home Church. The girls dressed up in white. They did recitations. They hung their schoolwork all around the inside of Home Church so that the visitors could see it. And they had needlework, painting. They were also musical performances, and there was a huge platform, and the principal would sit on that platform. And the girls would come up, and each one would answer a question that the principal asked them. There were people everywhere when this happened. And if you can imagine, there were dirt streets. The Moravians were tinsmiths, they were shoemakers, they were silversmiths, they were tradesmen, and their shops were there. So everybody knew about that community. So people came from everywhere when the girls' graduation was, because it was a big time in Salem. Believe it or not, the boys from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill actually came. They were a land grant college, so we had a bunch of boys up there looking at these pretty girls in these white dresses. Well, Mary and Martha McNair, the daughters of Delilah Van McNair, and the granddaughters of the man with the big house, James Van, who had been first at that council, were the first Cherokee girls to attend the girls' boarding school. Their mother, Delilah, had become a faithful member of the mission the Moravians founded at Spring Place. The McNair girls began school when they were 11 and 12, and like most of other girls, they attended school and stayed 2 years. Delilah and David McNair traveled to Salem from Spring Place, Georgia, to attend their daughter's graduation and to take their daughters home. Remember, Delilah's Cherokee, and one must wonder how she was received by the other wealthy women attending the festivities. However, as a communicant member of the Spring Place mission, Delilah was considered a member of the Cherokee Moravian sisterhood. The Moravians felt Delilah was one of their own and requested that she be allowed to take communion in Salem. That was a real honor. That was meant she was really included in that community. So the two Van grandchildren came. The third Cherokee girl to attend the school was Sally Ridge. Sally Ridge's father, Major Ridge, first requested that the Moravians accept Sally in the girls' boarding school. Let's see. Oops, sorry, wrong way. There's Major Ridge. Major Ridge's request was denied because the Moravians knew him and they felt like he didn't have any money. But Susan, like Delilah, was a faithful member of the community of women at the Spring Place Mission, and the Moravians knew Susanna. She was a part of the Moravian sisterhood, and like other Cherokee women, she had resources of her own to ensure that Sally's tuition was paid. So they actually accepted Sally, and it's in the records because of her mom, because she was in the mission and she had money. Now, the Ridge brings Sally to Salem. And the Ridge spoke no English, but with him is either a slave or an adoptee, we don't know, but a young man of color that did speak English, and he translated everything for the Ridge while the Ridge was in Salem. Sally, like most girls, and this, of course, is a photograph when Sally is much older. Sally, like most girls, stayed 2 years, even though she had traveled with her father to Washington, which would seem to make her more comfortable just among people. It was noted that Sally was a bit shy and different. When outsiders came into her classroom, Sally was so shy that she looked away, choosing not to address them. And at night, one of the things she did different than the other girls is she took off her outer clothes and wrapped herself in a blanket to sleep. Both Sally's parents were Cherokee, and she likely practiced more traditional Cherokee ways. But Susanna, her mother, doesn't seem shy. When she comes to Salem for Sally's graduation, one of the school teachers is so impressed with Susanna Ridge that she writes a description of the event. And do you guys know how wonderful it is to find somebody that writes about a Cherokee woman in the early 1800s? It's a big deal. Here's what she said. Susanna Ridge wore a man's fur hat without ornament and dressed very plainly, although neatly. But it was observed that the white ladies, in their silks and satins, left the seat of honor beside the principal on the front row for Susanna Ridge. The author of this account, a single sister and teacher, pointed out that while Susanna's clothes, lacked the quality and ornamentation of the other women's dresses, they were certainly acceptable by Moravian standards, describing Susanna as possessing intelligence in her own right. The teacher's comment suggests she perceives Susanna as an equal. Susanna demonstrates her pride in Sally's education by her very attendance at the examination. Like the Moravian sisters, Susanna values women's education. The white ladies visiting the Moravian communities to attend their children's examination likely didn't know how to interact with this plainly dressed Cherokee woman who didn't speak English, a situation Moravians were at ease with, although they spoke no Cherokee. The connection of the Cherokee women to the Moravians ran deeper than superficial appearances, for they were sisters in the mission in the Cherokee Nation. Chief John Ross and his delegation traveled back and forth to Washington, and often they came through Salem when they were coming from Washington. For years, Principal Chief John Ross fought against the Cherokees' removal and the relocation of his nation to the West, and the civilization process of Native American tribes by the United States government and state governments continued, though, in really full swing. The Cherokee Nation was divided into 160-acre plots, which were sold by lotteries to whites. The lottery winners took the best land, which would mean the land that belonged to the wealthy Cherokees. At the pressure of the Cherokees to move, west escalated. Lewis Ross, Chief John Ross's brother, feared for the safety of his daughter, Araminta. She was with him, living at the agency where Lewis Ross's business was. But the gunsmith, Timothy Vogler, was traveling in the Cherokee Nation, and he was a Moravian. You know, he was a part of the Salem community. He stopped by Ross's home, and Brother Vogler asked Timothy Vogler to take his daughter to Salem. Vogler agreed, and Araminta, a 10-year-old Cherokee girl, traveled by wagon with the gunsmith from Spring Place, Georgia, to the girls' boarding school. Now, less than a year after Araminta arrives in Salem, Ann and Cynthia Rogers, the daughters of John Rogers and Sarah Cordy, arrive at the girls' boarding school. Lottery winners again had taken their parents home, as Georgians claimed the best land first. Just a month later, Lewis Ross arrived in Salem with the daughter of his brother, Chief John Ross. Earlier, Chief Ross had returned home from Washington to find his family gone and lottery winners in possession of his home, and he wanted Jane to be educated and safe. Jane Ross was 14 when she arrived in Salem, so she was a bit older. She stayed 3 years. She developed strong relationships with the single sisters that would last her entire life. Actually, during the Civil War, Jane lived in Bethlehem with the Moravians. On May 23rd, 1838, we can just do that. In 1838, federal troops, the Georgia Guard, Tennessee Volunteers, began rounding up the Cherokees and putting them in removal forts. The Cherokee situation now became unbearable. There was smallpox and dysentery in the camps. Meanwhile, the Moravians in Salem received a letter from Lucy Butler. Now, Lucy Butler is a missionary that also was in the Cherokee Nation with her husband. And she writes the Moravians and reminds them that the Cherokees are going to need teachers when they reach the West. So Lucy Butler tells the Moravians she's already placed several girls in school to continue their studies so that they could help teach. And Lucy Butler asked the Moravians to accept George Hicks's oldest daughter, Delilah Hicks, gratis, free in their school. The Hicks family were devoted members of the Moravian mission. George Hicks, who, if you remember, is a detachment leader, attends the Moravian Mission School as a boy and had served as an interpreter for the Moravians for many years. Now, George Hicks writes Salem himself. So the second letter comes from Salem and says, please, will you take my youngest daughter as well? It will be a long time before we have schools established in the West. The Moravians accept both girls gratis, and they're younger. They're really younger than they normally took at the school. On the eve of removal, George Hicks travels from Tennessee to Salem in a wagon to bring both his daughters to the safety of the Moravian sisters. He worships with the Moravians and returns to his people. When George Hicks reaches the Cherokee, he is asked to lead one of the detachments who will travel west on the long journey to Indian Territory known today as the Trail of Tears. There's George. This was a wonderful find. I can't even believe I found that photograph. It was in the Bethlehem Archives, one of the Moravians' archives in the northern province. Chief Ross, not knowing the roundup had begun, stops in Salem on his way from Washington back to his people to fetch his daughter Jane. Prior to leaving Salem, he attends home church. And this is so interesting. He attends church on Independence Day, July 4th, as they are taking the independence away from the Cherokee. Chief Ross and Jane travel by stagecoach, and while traveling back, heading for their people who have now been rounded up and are in Tennessee, Chief Ross writes his friend, John Howard Payne, while traveling, and I'm going to read you that letter. I arrived here, he means Salem, in good health, and had the satisfaction to find my daughter also well. The Moravians have 3 missionary gentlemen now among the Cherokee who will be close observers and will record the events of the times as will be important to be known. Having left Salem before closing this letter, I now avail myself of the earliest moment to mail it. The fatigue of the stage travel, the want of rest, together with the chilling news occasionally received from passengers we meet on the road from the West respecting the unhappy conditions of the Cherokee, makes it difficult for me to write you anything in detail. This I must defer until I shall have reached the encampment of my nation. Very sincerely yours, John Ross. Wait. Ah, sorry, guys. The horror of removal remains well documented. Thousands die on the trail. Most are the old and the very young. Cherokees lost not only their future, but their past as they lose those people. I don't think we can imagine the chaos the 13,000 Cherokees people experienced marching from Tennessee to Alabama to Indian Territory, today the state of Oklahoma. But we do know one thing. They rebuilt their homes, they planted crops, they reestablished their government, they built schools and churches, and they successfully rebuilt their nation. After an arduous journey to the Cherokee Nation from Tennessee and Alabama, Lewis Ross and George Hicks returned to Salem to get their daughters and take them to the new Cherokee Nation in Indian Territory. Delilah went on to teach in the mission school and Cherokee schools, corresponding with her teachers at Salem through her entire life. This is one of her teachers, Sophia Dorothea Ruda Vogler. Jane Ross also remains close to the Moravian sisters and teachers and follows in their footsteps by teaching and leading other women in Indian Territory. Jane Ross actually goes to Bethlehem during the Civil War and lives in the Moravian community. The relationship between the Moravians and the Cherokee did not stop with removal. Moravian men and women among the Cherokee did not remove with them. Rather, they went ahead of the nation to find a place to begin a mission and a school in Indian territory that would last until the 1890s. One of the Cherokee's beloved teachers, Sophia Ruda Vogler, marries and travels west to teach in the mission school. You can view the site of New Spring Place in present-day Oklahoma, complete with God's acre. The Cherokee Nation has bought that property and it will remain preserved. So, on the 250th anniversary of the girls' school, we honored the Cherokee girls who attended Salem. And this is that plaque. It names all of them. I've not talked about all the girls, but I've talked about the ones that came before removal. And I'm going to show you the little garden. This is the garden it's in, and it's right behind the girls' school, where they actually lived and went to school. Now I'm going to try to play this. Jack, how do I make it work? Mhm.
Is there an area somewhere at the bottom that you click on to start the video?
Yep, there you go, right there.
Service
Perfect.
of the Cherokee people. He served on the 1999 Cherokee Constitutional Convention. He's a member of the Cherokee Nation Tribal Council. He served as Secretary of State for the Cherokee Nation. And for the last 3 years, has served as our principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. It's my honor to introduce my friend, Chief Chuck Hopkins Jr.
Widow to my dear friend Jack Baker, Ms. Barnes, Reverend Ralph, President McGee, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor to be speaking before you at this wonderful institution. I know she's been recognized, but I want you all to know that the person who is most responsible for keeping this century-old friendship between the Moravians, this institution, and the Cherokee Nation in the modern times, she's been mentioned, is Anna Smith. She's got my admiration. I bring you greetings from the Cherokee Nation, and you have my congratulations, my admiration on celebrating 250 years of excellence, 250 years of an institution committed to not only education, but education with a progressive view about what that should be. As the president said, education that is based on lifting people up. And I have been struck by the fact that this institution, as it has looked back on 250 years, has taken care to make sure that no part of that long and wonderful story is marginalized. In fact, it's all celebrated. And I've noticed that, and I think that says a great deal about this institution. Today is a day about two things for me. One is Cherokee resilience, and the other is the power of friendship. Think about the young ladies who went to school here. Think about what was going on in their world. Think about the courage it took for them to come to this institution. Think about the courage that was required of their countrymen as they faced the great difficulties of the 19th century for the Cherokee people. The Cherokee Nation had a great many important decisions to make in that pivotal century, and we had a great many forks in the road. We could go one way or we could go the other. What I am struck by is that our people in the 19th century always had an eye towards future generations, always had an eye as to how we could temper ourselves against the difficulties ahead. We leaned on something powerful and important as a people, and that was the power of developing the intellect and the capacity of the generation coming up. That idea was more powerful than any sword, any weapon, any shield we've ever wielded as Cherokee people. It's the reason that we resisted our removal so mightily. And even though we were forcibly removed during a period of time in this country marked by injustice to Native peoples, even though we faced dispossession, even though we faced oppression, what did we do when we were removed? We picked ourselves back up and we tapped into that reserve of growing intellect, growing capacity to rebuild one of the great democracies in this country after our removal, to rebuild ourselves economically, to rebuild ourselves as a great society. These 13 young ladies who went to school here symbolize that great power, symbolize what it is the Cherokee people did in the face of some of the most daunting obstacles any people have ever faced. They themselves would be a part of a generation that would go on to build and rebuild the Cherokee Nation time and time again. That generation of Cherokees, and specifically these young ladies, would go on to help shape a society that believed in education. I mean, my goodness, we started the first institution of higher learning for any woman of any race west of the Mississippi. We know it today as Northeastern State University. We started a free system of public education for our people long before anyone ever heard of the state of Oklahoma. We did that because of these 13 young ladies and what they represent. We did that because the Cherokee people believed in progress and that the key to progress was education. The key to progress was intellectual growth, and the key to progress was making sure that the generation coming up had a greater capacity for greatness than the generations that came before it. As long as we believe that as Cherokees, we know the best days of the Cherokee Nation lay ahead of us. But the other things that today is about the enduring power of friendship. Now, as proud as I am of the Cherokee Nation and our ancestors, and as much as I know that it was grit and determination, pulling ourselves up time and time again, that is in part responsible for me even being on this stage today as the elected chief of the Cherokee Nation, the truth of the matter is we did not get here alone. We got here because we had friends and allies. We have no dearer friends. We had no greater ally and have no greater ally today than the Moravian Church and this fine institution of higher learning. That's the truth, and we ought to say it. It's the truth, and we can see it demonstrated throughout history. I mean, in the times in which we were resisting removal and figuring out our path, figuring out which fork in the road we might take, the Moravians were our friends. In our darkest hour, as we faced removal and as we stared down possible termination and extermination, the Moravians were there with us. When we rebuilt in our new land, this kinship we had with the Moravians was still with us, and they were with us. And today, as we undertake really important efforts in areas of historic preservation and education, this friendship is as vital as ever. And that's one reason I'm proud to announce today, thanks to the urging of my friend Jack Baker, that we will donate $25,000 to get that next volume of the Moravian archives from our people back into publication. What I would ask, my simple request is when that publication comes out, let's make a special commemoration of the 13 young ladies who went to school here. Because in a real sense, I am on this stage, the Cherokee people are still exercising one of the great democracies on this continent, and we are still a force for great hope, great opportunity, great progress because of those 13 young ladies and the effort that they represent and the power of intellectual development that brought them to this institution. Ladies and gentlemen, today is about Cherokee resiliency, and it's about the great friendship between the Cherokee people, the Moravian Church, and Salem College. As long as we tap into that friendship, as long as we share in that resiliency, not only are the best days for the Cherokee people ahead of us, the best days for this institution are ahead of us. Let's make the next 250 years even better than the first 250 years. Thank you all very much.
Jack, I've still got, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I've still got those 4 slides I want to show. Now, how do I do that?
Can you click on them or?
Okay.
The servant of the Cherokee people.
Okay, ladies, do you recognize anybody you know there? Some of you folks, I told Jack I had to end with this. This is where I met up with Jack Baker and Maribel Chase and all the wonderful Cherokee women that I have been contributed to my life for the last 20 some years. Now, Maribel Chase is the one with the pocketbook. And Jack, who is that with the pony? Can you name any of those?
It's Carol Richmond with her back to us with the Pocahontas Club. And David, can you help us with some of the others. There's Ruth Faulkner in the back, Virgie Starr, Jay Faulkner.
Hazel Sharp.
Yes. Hazel's in the pink and gray tear dress.
Mary Bell, can you
Yes,
see
it
that?
is. That's Betty Barker and Mary Adair over there on my left.
Oh, yes.
I think
Right.
next, I think
Right
in
next
front
to
of,
the bus in the background.
I think in front of Ruth is Betty Merrifield.
Yes. And then who's the lady? I can't remember the lady's name in front of Ruth and blocking most of Betty Merrifield.
Well, wait, I have one more picture. Oh, well.
Oh,
Oh, there's Minta in the foreground there.
There's Mary.
Mary and Ruth and Betty Merrifield, Minta.
Is that Patsy?
Yes. Patsy is on the, well, the far right, our far right.
And there's Jerry Wood.
God bless Jerry Wood.
Yes.
Yes.
So it just seemed appropriate, since we were talking about women, that I could show some of the Cherokee women who came in their tear dresses to the opening of
The Visitor Center there at,
Visitor Center. Jack, you want to tell them what this is?
yes, this is the opening of the Visitor Center at the Van House. And then it was after this opening that we had the dedication at the Spring Place God's Acre, which is here. Someone was a little bit younger then.
I had brown hair. And you all had a different chief. So many of you don't probably know this if you've been to Spring Place. There is James Van's house, and then we managed to get the acre, which the Moravians call a cemetery God's acre. That's what they call it. And we did ground sounding radar, the archaeologists for the state of Georgia, and we located where the graves are. We know they're there. And this was for the dedication of that. And let me just tell you, it was so hot that day that you could hardly stand. That is beautiful now. It's in grass. It has, and I don't think I have a picture of it. It has wonderful signage. But it was just a glorious time when the Cherokee came back and we celebrated the Moravian Cherokee history in the East. So this is actually within sight of the Spring Place mission that I've been talking about. It's also within sight of the Van House. And this is the cemetery. And it's lovely today.
And
And
thanks to Anna, the lady agreed, and her sons agreed to donate this to the, well, actually the Georgia Park Service, the Van House.
No, well, they actually, I spoke down there. This is before I knew any of you Cherokee folks, and I spoke at a meeting down there with a bunch of people that are members of the Van House Friends. And the lady who owns a lot of land down there and her son were behind me. And afterwards, I went up and just embarrassed her as much as I could to get her to give us that acre of land and let us set it aside so that there would be a place, a plot of land to go and remember where some of our early leaders were, where there was a school, where Charles, one of our early chiefs, is buried, and where a Moravian wonderful woman, Anna Rosina Gamble. Anyway, I'm not going to go on and on. I'm going to close, but I'm going to take it back to the women's pictures if I can. There you go. Thank you. Sorry, I'm such a